celebrate myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass.
In 1855, a book appeared which changed the course of world literature. It was unlike any other book that had ever been published. A new species, organic like its title, Leaves of Grass.
Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems. You shall possess the good of the earth and sun. There are millions of suns left. You shall no longer take things at second or third hand, nor look through the eyes of the dead.
My father was a high school teacher across the river in Paterson, New Jersey, and he taught Whitman. So I got Whitman very early as, as a kind of patriotic poet, an American poet, the high school hero poet. Then I had a really interesting high school teacher in Eastside High School, Mrs. Frances Durbin, 300 pounds, who read the line, "I find no fat sweeter than that which sticks to my own bones." And I realized the enormous humanity and charm of Whitman, his complete appeal.
Bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love.
I really came to love Whitman when I was in France, teaching at the University of Grenoble in 1956. When I was 29 years old. I taught a course in Whitman, and you can't imagine in any other country a young poet having to discover the great national poet on his own 100 years after the great work had been written. But that's the way it was.
I bequeath myself to the grass to grow.
Dirt.
The dirt. I bequeath myself.
When I was growing up as a poet from, say, 17 for 10 years, I was growing up under the new criticism, which couldn't find room for him. When I did read him, I didn't know how to take it. The result was that I saved him from my middle age, which was very fortunate. Suddenly, when I was in my 30s, I started reading Whitman, and I was ready for him. And here was this immense poet, this enormously great poet of my own country.
I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles.
From his earliest days on Long Island, much that Whitman saw on his trips and excursions found its way into his poetry. The world viewed on a jaunt, or a newspaper round from Brooklyn to New York. When he was old, he settled in Mickle Street, Camden, New Jersey, visited regularly by friends, admirers, and disciples. He spoke of the many editions and revisions of Leaves of Grass, and busied himself with the definitive version of the book that had occupied his whole life.
It is tragic, the fate of the first leaves. None of them were sold. Practically none. Well, I did get rid of all the books. I sent a few copies around.
Here it is. There's a copy of it. 1855. It didn't have his name on it as author. Copyrighted by Walter Whitman. You could more or less guess that Walt Whitman wrote it. It's comparatively brief, short, first version of Leaves of Grass, 95 pages, but they're just amazing.
Whitman sent one of these 795 copies of Leaves of Grass to an American literary giant who had been calling for a new American poetry.
I find Leaves of Grass the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom America has yet contributed. I greet you at the beginning of a great career, which yet must have had a long foreground somewhere for such a start. Signed, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Hundreds of pictures were taken of Whitman, but only a few survive of the emerging poet who burst upon the literary scene in the 1850s, the writer who started as a printer and journalist. Whitman's first job was as an apprentice printer in 1831, when he was 12 years old. Between 1830 and 1850, the number of daily newspapers in the U.S. grew from 36 to 254. It was popular journalism, aimed at the working man, with feature stories about urban life and accounts of crime and violence. Whitman worked as contributor, reviewer, or editor on a number of penny papers. The new medium fostered a new profession with its own personality. The reporter, a bohemian observer with his fingers on the city's pulse.
What's important about Whitman's journalistic background, I think, is that this, in a sense, is his bank account in experience. This is the way he learns the city. This is the way he learns what he calls million-footed Manhattan. This is the way he learns about violence and conflict. This is the way he learns about American society. It's a very direct exposure to experience. There's nothing bookish about Whitman's education.
I abandoned the conventional themes. None of the stock ornamentation or the choice plots of love and war. Exceptional high personages of old world song. Take a few lines of that.
Sometimes a troop of damsels glad, an abbot on an ambling pad. Sometimes a curly shepherd lad, or long-haired page in crimson clad, goes by to tower at Camelot.
Goes by to tower at Camelot.
He set out to write a poetry which appeared to have no literary antecedents, which had cut itself loose from conventional references and conventional subject matter. Conventional poetry tended to deal with completely irrelevant feudal experience with the world of Sir Walter Scott or the world of William Shakespeare. Whitman wanted very much a poetry that would deal with the world that he knew, with real things, with stevedores, with steam engines.
As far as actually observing, seeing, experiencing, tasting, feeling the things around one, Whitman was rather unusual. Most of the other 19th century poets, Emily Dickinson apart, were blind. Poe, you could say, was absolutely blind. You would not know that Poe lived in New York, walked down the same streets among the same sights that Whitman did. Poe's poetry was the poetry of a blind man, a man who is imagining some realm somewhere else.
Poe was a dream generalist, that is a philosophical dreamer, who had phantoms that he described in detail. Melville, the other great poet of the 19th century, in his prose had infinite command of minute particulars. In his poetry, quite a good command, but still was writing in a limited, closed form, and but he was getting close. Emily Dickinson had intelligent metaphysical detail and garden detail, but it was a smaller form. Now, Whitman opened up space completely, opened up the space of the line, broke open the line so he could say anything he want, could notice anything he want, and could bring in all the everyday particulars of kitchenware life, dock life, skyscraper life,
And it's out of his experience of Manhattan and Brooklyn, as Whitman claimed, that leaves of grass arose. He is very much a city poet. He is, in many ways, our first urban poet.
They were looking for an American bard, but they didn't realize that to have one, that bard had to embrace what was American, what was around one, the actual new things of the world. He was immersed in that world, and he loved it.
I often wander all day on Manhattan Island, through streets toward the East River, on purpose to have the pleasure of hearing the voices of the native-born and bred workmen and apprentices in the spar yards, on piers, caulkers on the ship scaffolds, workmen in iron, mechanics to or from their shops, drivers calling to their horses, and the like.
Well, there's the metaphor of the melting pot. New York full of the boats full of immigrants coming in still. The best descriptions of it are probably still in some of Whitman's poems.
The butcher boy puts off his killing clothes or sharpens his knife at the stall in the market. I loiter, enjoying his repartee and his shuffle and breakdown. Blacksmiths with grimed and hairy chests environ the anvil. Each has his main sledge. They are all out. There is a great heat in the fire. From the cinder-strewed threshold, I follow their movements. The lithe sheer of their waists plays even with their massive arms. Whenever he could, he chose the rude word for the elegant one. He chose the Anglo-Saxon word for the Latinate word. Rest the chuff of your hand on my hip, the blab of the pave. Words like that simply didn't appear in the poetry of his time. The blab of the pave, the tires of carts, and slough of boot soles, and talk of the promenaders. The heavy omnibus, the driver with his interrogating thumb, the clank of the shod horses on the granite floor, the carnival of sleighs, the clinking and shouted jokes and pelts of snowballs.
You know, he thought of making a dictionary of American words. He loved American slang. The phrase "so long" was something he loved.
We speak of poets having a good ear, but with Whitman you have to say he had a good mouth. You know, he tasted the words. They have a physical body.
Sees a bright juice suffuse heaven. Kerouac would say, imagine a line like that. It's like Shakespeare. Sees a bright juice suffuse heaven.
In the latter part of an afternoon, it makes a delightful little jaunt to go out and see the sunset. 100 years hence, I often imagine what an appearance that walk will present on a fine summer afternoon. You and I, reader, and quite all the people who are now alive, won't be much thought of then. But the world will be just as jolly, and the sun will shine just as bright. And the rivers off there, the Hudson on one side and the East on the other, will slap along their green waves precisely as now. And other eyes will look upon them about the same as we do.
Others will enter the gates of the ferry and cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west, and the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands, large and small. 50 years hence, others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. Just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. Just as any of you is one of a living crowd, I was one of a crowd. Just as you are refreshed by the gladness of the river and the bright flow, I was refreshed. Just as you stand and lean on the rail, yet hurry with the swift current. I stood, yet was hurried. Just as you look on the numberless masts of ships and the thick-stemmed pipes of steamboats, I looked. Some people were affected by him, Hart Crane in particular, but one really didn't feel that American poetry moved out of Whitman, moved forward from Whitman in the same way that, say, French poetry moved forward from Baudelaire. So it really wasn't until the 1950s that Whitman returned to our poetry. To me, the decisive work was Allen Ginsberg's Howl.
I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix.
After I wrote Howl, I went back to Whitman because I was interested in how he handled the long line, and I read Whitman from beginning to end in this particular modern library edition of Leaves of Grass. He broke open the line so that you could talk with unobstructed breath. You could use the breath as long as you wanted to explain your idea.
The longer the line, the more music can build up.
He worships the human voice, going at full blast sometimes. At one point, he says he could not have written Leaves of Grass had it not been for Italian opera. He means Bellini and Rossini and Donizetti and others in vogue then. Practically every major city in the country had a resident or traveling opera company. New Orleans, Philadelphia, New York, Boston.
I hear the bravuras of birds, the bustle of growing wheat, gossip of flames, clack of sticks cooking my meals. I hear the sound of the human voice, a sound I love. I hear all sounds as they are tuned to their uses. Sounds of the city and sounds out of the city, sounds of the day and night. I hear the violoncello or man's heart's complaint, and hear the keyed cornet or else the echo of sunset. I hear the chorus, it is a grand opera, this indeed is music. A tenor, large and fresh as the creation, fills me. The orbic flex of his mouth is pouring and filling me full. I hear the trained soprano, she convulses me like the climax of my love grip. The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches unnameable ardors from my breast. It throbs me to gulps of the farthest down horror. It sails me. I dab with bare feet. They are licked by the indolent waves. I am exposed, cut by bitter and poisoned hail. The King James Bible was the greatest influence on Whitman's prosody of any poetry he read, of any literature he read. In two ways. One, those long flowing cadences which come through the prose of the Bible, and two, the parallel structure, in the sense that phrase after phrase would repeat the same syntax, the same words, the same thoughts, and make variations on those.
Ladies and gentlemen, now The question as to whether there's a right or wrong in enslaving a Negro. I hold that Illinois...
Political oratory was another major influence on Whitman's work. As a journalist and partisan, he followed the great political debates of his day. The power of the human voice to reach large audiences and move them inspired Whitman to try and do the same through his poetry.
What he was looking for was free expressiveness and amplitude and grandeur. All of these he believed to be qualities that were appropriate to American democracy, to the expanding American empire even, to the American spirit. Whitman believed that it was the destiny of the United States to democratize and redeem the entire world. He believed in what was then called manifest destiny, that is, the destiny of the United States to fill up its continental limits and even to go way beyond that.
Manifest destiny was more than idea. It was a political credo and meant the annexation of Texas from Mexico, the addition of Arizona, California, and New Mexico to the national domain. For Whitman and Emerson, the expanding territory of America called for a new kind of poet, an explorer, to open up new vistas in verse, just as the pioneers were opening up the continent.
Oh, my book and I. What a period we presume to span. Those 30 years between 1850 and 1880. And America, in them. The United States themselves are essentially the greatest poem. Here is not merely a nation, but a teeming nation of nations. Here are the roughs and beards and space and ruggedness and nonchalance that the soul loves.
But each man and each woman of you I lead upon a knoll. My left hand hooks you round the waist. My right hand points to landscapes of continents and a plain public road. Shoulder your duds, and I will mine, and let us hasten forth. Wonderful cities and free nations we shall fetch as we go. If you tire, give me both burdens, and rest the chuff of your hand on my hip, and in due time you shall repay the same service to me, for after we start, we never lie by again.
If Whitman tells America, I am large, I contain multitudes, it's that he contains multitudes of thoughts just like anybody else. I am vast. My mind is as big as the horizon that you see about, because when I turn around, I can see the horizon. So therefore, it enters my mind. So therefore, my mind is as big as the horizon.
Whitman's sense of constant expansion is not simply geographical or political. It goes into an entire notion of a cosmic vision.
He wrote in a kind of persona that allowed him to speak for the American human being rather than for Walter Whitman. Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshy, and sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. No sentimentalist, no stander above men and women or apart from them, no more modest than immodest. Unscrew the locks from the doors, unscrew the doors themselves from their jambs.
Walt Whitman, one of the roughs, an American, eating, drinking, brawling, wenching, embracing in some sense, whether sexually or not, all who come along. could not be more at variance with the actual fact.
Whitman, in his poetry, presents himself as a kind of brawler and a loud fellow and so on. And in real life, in person, I think he was quite quiet for the most part.
He was, of course, very fond of saying, following Emerson, who had said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So Whitman proclaims very proudly in the very midst of Song of Myself, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes.
He tried to universalize what he lived and make actually not only make what he wrote, but make himself a kind of type of the American.
Of pure American breed, of reckless health, his body perfect, free from taint, free forever from headache and dyspepsia, full-blooded, 6 feet high, a good feeder.
Whitman, in many ways, is a poet of liberation. He's trying to liberate poetry from conventional modes. He's also trying to liberate men and women from conventional modes of behavior and sexual conduct. What he wants is a frank recognition of the glory and beauty of nakedness.
The expression of a well-made man appears not only in his face, it is in his limbs and joints also. It is curiously in the joints of his hips and wrists. It is in his walk, the carriage of his neck, the flex of his waist and knees. Dress does not hide him. The strong, sweet, supple quality he has strikes through the cotton and flannel. To see him pass conveys as much as the best poem, perhaps more. I sing the body electric. Have you ever loved the body of a woman? Have you ever loved the body of a man? If anything is sacred, the human body is sacred. O my body, I believe the likes of you shall stand or fall with my poems, and that they are my poems. Man's, woman's, child's, youth's, wife's, husband's, mother's, father's, young man's, young woman's poems.
The poems in Leaves of Grass were constantly changing. Whitman's one great poem was always in the process of being rewritten. There were 95 pages in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, which Whitman printed himself at his own expense. The second edition followed a year later. The third edition in 1860 was the first to be picked up by a publisher, a thick volume of 456 pages. Many of the early poems were revised. 124 new poems were added.
The version of Out of the Cradle that was in 1860 had a different title, called A Word Out of the Sea. He worked over the poem a great deal, cuttings and revisions. Well, I noticed that in the poem, as he first published it, there was the line that he cut out right here on this page. Out of the boy's mother's womb, from the nipples of her breasts, out of the 9th month midnight. It's just listed there casually as a source, but it was too explicit. In a way, the whole poem acts out and sings that loss, and it sings it all the more clearly as he revised it by not stating it.
Even as a boy, I had the fancy, the wish to write a piece, perhaps a poem, about the seashore, that suggesting dividing line, contact, junction, the solid marrying the liquid. Hours, days in my Long Island youth and early manhood, I haunted the shores. I remember well, I felt that I must one day write a book expressing this liquid, mystic theme.
Out of the cradle, endlessly rocking, Out of the mockingbird's throat, the musical shuttle, out of the 9th month midnight, over the sterile sands and the fields beyond, where the child, leaving his bed, wandered alone, bareheaded, barefoot, down from the showered halo, up from the mystic play of shadows twining and twisting as if they were alive, out from the patches of briars and blackberries, from the memories of the bird that chanted to me, from your memories, sad brother, from the fitful risings and fallings I heard, from under that yellow half-moon late risen and swollen as if with tears, from those beginning notes of yearning and love there in the mist.
Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking is my favorite single poem of Whitman's, and I think one of the great poems that anyone has ever written, ever. Magnificent poem. He wrote it at the height of his ability, after the first edition of, and the second edition of Leaves of Grass, when he had learned how to write a Walt Whitman poem.
A man, yet by these tears, a little boy again, throwing myself on the sand, confronting the waves, I, chanter of pains and joys, uniter of here and hereafter, taking all hints to use them, but swiftly leaping beyond them, a reminiscence sing.
He was born on Long Island in 1819. There were 8 Whitman children who survived infancy. 3 or 4 of them were severely disturbed. And out of the 8, it's Whitman who survives and who announces himself as the poet of perfect health. The family was constantly sinking in the social scale, the economic scale. His father is an unsuccessful farmer, unsuccessful house builder. There's the father's drunkenness, the father's depressions.
If you came out of that household, which was a wild and peculiar household, if you evidently could bear even the touch of your own kindred, as little as Whitman could bear the touch of his kindred, if you make as the supreme moments of your poetry, the extraordinary moment in As I Ebbed with the Ocean of Life, when you throw yourself on the sands and really try to embrace the whole of the beach at once, and you say that this is finally your embrace of your own father. And even more crucially, in When Lilacs Last at the Dooryard Bloomed, when you accept the embrace of the ocean rustling up around your feet and actually use it to violate the greatest Western taboo, use it as an image of entering the mother sexually. Both passages reflect, I think, a Whitman who probably from the time he had the earliest choice about it would not willingly touch either his mother or his father, let alone anyone after them.
He loved his fellows. He loved his young fellows. And that's sort of universal. Whether it was genital is another matter. Likely it was, as I know I've slept with Neil Cassidy, who slept with Gavin Arthur, who slept with Edward Carpenter, who described sleeping with Whitman to Gavin Arthur. So there was perhaps some genital directness there.
I doubt very much that Whitman had ever allowed himself to have sexual contact with any human being.
Probably not until the 1850s did he realize that he was homosexual, and probably not until then did he have some kind of sexual experiences, which must have been extremely powerful for him, since he was subject to the same inhibitions as the whole period was. And yet, I can't imagine that he freely pursued a sexual life. I imagine, on the contrary, that he lived in a kind of dread of discovery and humiliation, and so suppressed his sexual life to a rather extraordinary degree.
There is a crucial line in Song of Myself which reads, "To touch my body to someone else's is about as much as I can bear."
Earth my likeness, in which he finally confesses completely to anybody who's reading carefully. I now suspect there's something fierce in you eligible to burst forth. For an athlete is enamored of me, and I of him. For toward him there is something fierce and terrible in me, eligible to burst forth. I dare not tell it in words, not even in these songs. So there he's already told you.
Walt Whitman himself, the poet, is not the sexual swagger and the sexual athlete and blustering athlete of his poems. This is a case of a created dramatic identity. And you can't confuse one with the other, or you mustn't.
He never was overt in the sense of speaking of the love that dare not speak its name. On the other hand, his descriptions of his feelings were overt, a glimpse through an interstice caught of a crowd of workmen and drivers in a barroom around the stove late of a winter night. And I, unremarked, seated in a corner, of a youth who loves me and whom I love.
Of a youth who loves me and whom I love, silently approaching and seating himself near, that he may hold me by the hand, a long while amid the noises of coming and going, of drinking and oath and smutty jest. There we two, content, happy in being together, speaking little, perhaps not a word.
Whitman was romantically involved in the 1860s with Peter Doyle, a horse car conductor, 28 years his junior.
For the one I love most lay sleeping by me under the same cover in the cool night. In the stillness, in the autumn moonbeams, his face was inclined toward me, and his arm lay lightly around my breast. And that night I was happy. The fifth section of the Song of Myself describes a sexual act that is as explicit as you could possibly get, really. I mind how we lay in June, such a transparent summer morning. You settled your head athwart my hips and gently turned over upon me, and parted the shirt from my bosom bone, and plunged your tongue to my bare-stripped heart, and reached till you felt my beard, and reached till you held my feet.
It was raw stuff for much of the 19th century. He lost a job in Washington on account of his book because he was the author of these obscene poems, which hardly seem obscene to us. And it was also more or less banned in Boston. Whitman walked on the Boston Common with Emerson in 1860, with Emerson trying to persuade him to tone down the sexuality, especially the homoerotic images in Leaves of Grass. And Whitman listened, apparently, very politely and firmly said, no.
If I cut sex out, I might just as well cut everything out. The dirtiest book is an expurgated book. To leave something out is an apology, an admission that something is wrong.
Whitman's treatment of nakedness was similar to that of his contemporary, the painter Thomas Eakins, who also had little use for the exotic, the picturesque.
I never knew but one artist, and that's Tom Eakins, who could resist the temptation to see what they think ought to be rather than what is. Eakins is not a painter, he is a force. How could they appreciate Eakins, who breaks utterly away from the old, the outworn, the merely traditional, who faces the worst as well as the best?
Eakins was a great admirer of Whitman and painted him. His painting has a lot of the feel of the body that Whitman wanted to achieve. 28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men, and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life, and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed all over their bodies. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies swell to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray. If Whitman had one overriding ambition, that was it, to get sex and the body into poetry. And he couldn't do it as explicitly as I think he would have liked. The amazing thing is that he did it at all.
The large, appreciative audience Whitman expected for Leaves of Grass did not materialize. Even the literary world tended to find the overt sexuality offensive and the poetry formless.
Whitman fell into what he called a slough, a period of depression.
Oh, baffled, balked, bent to the very earth, oppressed with myself, that I have dared to open my mouth, aware now that amid all that blab whose echoes recoil upon me, I have not once had the least idea who or what I am.
The Civil War pulled Whitman out of himself. The national agony of the war entered his poetry, as did the experiences of ordinary soldiers.
In 1862, startled by news that my brother George had been seriously wounded, I hurriedly went down to the field of war in Virginia. Lived thenceforward in camp. Saw great battles and the days and nights afterward. Death readily risked. Without those 3 or 4 years, and the experience they gave, Leaves of Grass would not now be existing.
Whitman's role in the war was not killing but healing. He went to hospitals and took care of young kids who were wounded and sometimes dying, and kissed them on their deathbeds, probably weeping young boys who had never seen life. There's this old bearded Father Time figure, totally in love with them, taking care of them.
When Whitman went down to the war front, looking for his brother, practically the first sight that greeted him was the sight of a huge pile of amputated limbs outside the what served as emergency medical headquarters, field hospital then. The Civil War hospitals were rather brutal places. There was a great deal of suffering, a great deal of contagion. The surgeons tended to turn to amputation as the first resort.
The results of the late battle are exhibited everywhere about here in thousands of cases. The wounded lying on the ground, lucky if their blankets are spread on layers of pine or hemlock twigs or small leaves. No cots, seldom even a mattress. I do not see that I do much good to these wounded and dying.
He felt that he had a special, something special to give to the soldiers. So he would take a bath and buff himself so his cheeks were all ready and his white beard was all puffed up, and put on clean clothes and a great fresh shirt and so forth, and come into the hospital, the filth and misery of the hospital, like a god. And the soldiers knew him. They would call Walt, Walt to him from all directions as he walked down. He would stop, help one write a letter. Then a number of them died in his arms. I don't think he ever really recovered emotionally from the effects of the Civil War. I think, though, he got something from the experience he gave more than he got. Some are so young, some suffer so much. I recall the experience sweet and sad. Many a soldier's loving arms about this neck have crossed and rested. Many a soldier's kiss dwells on these bearded lips.
Whitman is not Homer singing of the valor or lamenting the death of the hero. He is the intimate poet commemorating the tiny specific sufferings of the dying as he sees them. That is not all he does. He writes also of what the war looks like.
And I saw askant the armies. I saw, as in noiseless dreams, hundreds of battle flags, borne through the smoke of the battles, and pierced with missiles. I saw them, and carried hither and yon through the smoke, and torn and bloody, and at last but a few shreds left on the staffs, and all in silence, and the staffs all splintered and broken. I saw battle corpses, myriads of them, and the white skeletons of young men. I saw them. I saw the debris of all the slain soldiers of the war. But I saw they were not as was thought. They themselves were fully at rest. They suffered not. The living remained and suffered. The mother suffered, and the wife, and the child, and the musing comrade suffered, and the armies that remained suffered. Reconciliation. Word over all, beautiful as the sky. Beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost. That the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly softly wash again and ever again this soiled world. For my enemy is dead. A man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white-faced and still in the coffin. I draw near, bend down, and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin.
The death of Abraham Lincoln touched Whitman as deeply as any event in his life. Whitman saw Lincoln as a kindred spirit, a president from the heartland of America who, like Whitman, spoke to the common people.
When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring, lilac blooming perennial, and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. Over the breast of the spring, the land, amid cities, amid lanes, and through old woods, where lately the violets peeped from the ground, spotting the gray debris, amid the grass in the fields, each side of the lanes, passing the endless grass, carrying a corpse to where it shall rest in the grave, night and day journeys a coffin. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, full of grief, not only for Lincoln, but for everything that had transpired during the war and for the maiming and death of all the soldiers on both sides. I am the man. I suffered. I was there.
Whitman's Civil War poems completed the great decade of his poetic creativity. He continued to write new poems, but his priority became the revising and polishing of Leaves of Grass. He revised all but 34 of over 400 poems and published edition after edition. Still considered an outsider by the literary public of his day, he busied himself with shoring up his reputation.
Keep it simple. Don't prettify me.
He's old, doesn't know what's happening to his body. So he says, as I sit writing here, sick and grown old, not my least burden is that dullness of the years, querilities, ungracious glooms aches, lethargies, constipation, whimpering ennui may filter in my daily songs. So that's a whole little poem. Worried about his constipation getting into his poetry. He never did that before. And finally realizes a more oriental calm in a poem called Twilight, in Sands at 70. The soft, voluptuous opiate shades, the sun just gone, the eager light dispelled. I too will soon be gone, dispelled. A haze, nirvana, rest and night, oblivion.
Whereto answering, the sea, delaying not, hurrying not, whispered me through the night, and very plainly before daybreak lisped to me the low and delicious word, death.
All of leaves of grass dissolve, all of the earth dissolved, all the universe dissolved, all the sound of the world dissolved, oblivion.
A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves.
For most people, death is a defeat, a terrible event. Whitman wanted to belong to life in such a way that the cycle of birth and death would be perfectly acceptable to him at every point. He wanted to be able to die and feel about death as he might feel about birth.
I look upon leaves of grass, now finished to the end of its opportunities and powers, as my definitive carte visite to the coming generations of the new world.
Closer yet I approach you. What thought you have of me now, I had as much of you. I laid in my stores in advance. I considered long and seriously of you before you were born. Who was to know what should come home to me? Who knows, but I am enjoying this. Who knows, for all the distance, but I am as good as looking at you now, for all you cannot see me.
Major funding for the Voices and Visions series is provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities Annenberg CPB project.